The lawyer called my son first. That was the protocol. He was the eldest. He was supposed to be the one who held things together. He asked the lawyer to read him the will over the phone. He did not ask where I was buried. He did not ask what happened. He asked about the house first, then the accounts, then whether the transfer could be expedited before the end of the quarter. I was sitting in a rental car 3 miles away, listening to every word on a second line. That was the day I understood that the fear I had carried for 30 years had not been paranoia. It had been prophecy. Margaret Calloway had not made the decision lightly. She had not made it quickly. She had not made it in anger or in grief or in the kind of sudden clarity that dissolves the moment the emotion passes. She had made it over the course of 2 years. In small increments, the way a person makes any decision they cannot take back, by sitting with it until the discomfort of not knowing became greater than the discomfort of finding out. She was 63 years old. She had been widowed for 12 years. She had built something real across the span of a long and genuinely hard-working life. And she had spent the last decade of that life watching the people she had raised begin to look at her in a way she could not quite name, but recognize the way you recognize a smell. Not with your thinking mind, but with something older and deeper and harder to argue with. She had grown up in a house outside Columbus, Ohio, where money was discussed the way other families discussed the weather. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was always there, always relevant, and always capable of changing without warning. Her father was a self-made man in the most literal sense. He had left school at 16, built a small contracting business by hand, and by the time Margaret was a teenager, had turned it into something that the family could be genuinely proud of. He was not sentimental about what he had built. He was clear-eyed and methodical, and he believed that the best thing a father could give his children was not money, but the understanding of what money meant, what it required, what it cost, and what it could do to the people who wanted it without having earned it. Margaret absorbed those lessons completely. She did not fully understand for many years that she had also passed them on. She married David Calloway at 26. A steady, decent man who loved her in the quiet, consistent way that some people are capable of for an entire lifetime without ever needing it acknowledged. They had 3 children together. Daniel was the eldest, organized, methodical, the kind of child who, by the age of 12, could tell you exactly what was in his room and exactly where. Renee was the middle child, sensitive in the way that middle children often are, the one who noticed when something had shifted in the household before anyone had named it. And Thomas was the youngest, sharp and restless and wired for ambition in a way that reminded Margaret, sometimes uncomfortably, of herself. They were not a perfect family. No family is. But they were real. And they were hers, and for a long time that felt like enough. The family home had a kitchen table that seated 8, even when there were only 5 of them. And on Sunday evenings, that table was never empty. David died in 2011. Prostate cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Margaret sat beside him in the hospital room on the last night and held his hand and did not look away. She had been prepared in the intellectual sense for years. She was not prepared in the actual sense because no one ever is. After the funeral, she went through the motions of grief the way competent people go through most difficult things, efficiently, privately, and without burdening anyone else with the worst of it. She kept the property portfolio running. She kept the accounts in order. She met with Patricia Wells, her attorney of 15 years, and made sure every document was updated and correct. She planted an African violet on the kitchen windowsill that same spring because David had always liked them, and she was not sure why that detail mattered to her, but it did. And she kept the plant alive for 9 years before it died the winter the heating failed. It was in the years after David's death that Margaret began to notice something she could not name. The phone calls from her children grew shorter. Not dramatically shorter, not in a way she could point to and say, there, that is the moment it changed. Just shorter. And the visits, which had been frequent in the early years of her widowhood, became occasions, events rather than habits. When she saw her children, they were present and warm and interested. And when she mentioned the estate, the properties, the accounts, the plan she and David had built slowly across 3 decades, there was a particular alertness that came into her children's voices. Not warmth, not concern, something more like attention. The kind of attention a person gives to a subject they have been thinking about privately and have not yet decided how much to reveal. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret told herself she was imagining it. She had always been prone to a certain quality of watchfulness that could, if she was not careful, tip into something less useful. She had inherited it from her father, who had trusted almost no one and had been right often enough that the distrust felt vindicated, and wrong often enough that it cost him things he could not recover. She was aware of this in herself. She had been working against it, in small ways, for most of her adult life. So when the alertness in her children's voices registered, she noted it, set it aside, and told herself it was the natural consequence of adults navigating the subject of inheritance. Uncomfortable for everyone, loaded with associations that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with the way money sits uneasily inside families. She closed that door in her mind. She turned back to the ordinary business of her days. The door did not stay closed. In the spring of 2019, Margaret experienced what her cardiologist described as a minor cardiac event, a warning, rather than a crisis, but the kind of medical moment that forces a certain clarity. She sat in the examination room afterward, dressed again, shoes tied, waiting for her blood pressure to be checked a second time. And she thought about the documents that governed what happened to everything she had built if she was not there to protect it. She called Patricia the following week. She updated the will. The structure was largely unchanged from the version she and David had filed together in 2009. The estate would be divided among the 3 children in equal thirds, with a formal portion set aside for a scholarship fund she had been quietly building in David's name. A fund designed to support first-generation college students from rural Ohio, because that was what David had been, and because she believed it was the right use of something they had worked for together. She told her children about the meeting. She did not share the specific numbers. She mentioned the scholarship fund. Daniel's response was measured and precise. He asked whether the fund had been structured as a charitable trust. He asked whether it had been funded yet. He asked, in a tone that managed to sound both casual and careful, whether the fund size had been formally determined or whether there was still flexibility in that figure. Margaret answered his questions. She wrote them down afterward, in the journal she had kept since her 40s, not because she thought she would need them later, but because the act of writing helped her think. She looked at the questions on the page and noted that none of them were about the fund's purpose. None of them were about the students it was meant to help. Every question was about the money. She closed the journal. She went to bed. She lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. Renee said very little during that visit. She helped clear the table after dinner, the way she always did. She hugged her mother goodbye at the door and held on for a few seconds longer than usual. Margaret noticed the hug. She thought about it on the drive back from walking Renee to her car. She could not decide whether the hug was grief, the quiet, forward-looking grief of a daughter who had just been reminded that her mother would not always be there, or whether it was something else. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when Thomas called. Thomas had always been the most direct of her 3 children, which Margaret had always read as honesty and was only now beginning to wonder whether it was something more calculated than that. He said he had been thinking about the scholarship fund. He said it was a generous idea. He said, and this is the sentence Margaret returned to again and again in the weeks that followed. He said he thought it was worth considering whether the family might benefit from managing that kind of charitable work internally, rather than through a formal external structure. He said it in a tone that was entirely reasonable. He said it in a tone that gave her nothing to argue with. She thanked him, said she would think about it. They said goodbye. She sat in the kitchen after the call, with her hand flat on the table and the afternoon light coming through the window where the African violet used to be. And she understood that she had reached the end of the period in which she could tell herself she was imagining things. It was Patricia who first described the arrangement, not as something she was recommending, not initially. She had a client, she said, in a different state, a different situation, a different family, who had used a legal framework that Patricia described carefully and precisely over the course of 2 separate meetings. The framework was uncommon. It existed in a gray area of estate law that was not illegal but required meticulous documentation and the cooperation of a small number of trusted parties. The premise was straightforward, even if the execution was not. A testator, the person whose estate was at issue, could, under specific conditions, observe the behavior of their beneficiaries during a simulated preliminary distribution process as a means of establishing the true intentions of those beneficiaries before any formal transfer occurred. Margaret asked Patricia to explain it again from the beginning. Patricia explained it again. Margaret asked for 2 weeks to consider it. She came back in 10 days. The plan worked like this. Margaret's physician, woman she had trusted for 11 years, would cooperate in documenting a medical event that would appear in all practical communications to have resulted in Margaret's death. The documentation would be constructed carefully and legally. Patricia's office would then initiate the estate's preliminary notification process. Her children would be informed, through proper legal channels, that their mother had passed. The estate would move toward a preliminary distribution phase. Patricia's office would conduct all subsequent communications with the 3 children, and Margaret, living in a rented property in a county 40 minutes away, would have access, through a second line connected to Patricia's office, to every call that her children made. She would hear everything. She would be present for none of it. She would be invisible, which had, in its own way, always been the point. She told no one in her family. She told 2 people outside it. The first was Patricia, who already knew. The second was Cecile, her oldest friend, a woman she had known since they were both 19 years old and studying in the same dormitory building and arguing about books they had not finished reading. Cecile, when she heard the plan described in full, sat for a very long time without saying anything. Then she said, "I need you to be ready for what you might hear." Margaret said she was ready. Cecile looked at her across the kitchen table, the same kitchen table, the same window, the same quality of afternoon light, and said, "I don't think you are. But I understand why you need to do it anyway." She drove away. Margaret watched the car until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then she went inside and began packing a bag. The notification went out on a Monday morning in October. The sky outside Patricia's office was the color of old linen, pale and textureless, and neither warm nor cold. Margaret was already in the rental property. The furniture was neutral and impersonal, in the way that rented furniture always is. A sofa the color of sand, curtains that did not quite reach the floor, a bedside lamp with a shade that had yellowed slightly at the edges. She had brought 3 things from her house: the journal, a photograph of David, and a sweater she had owned for 15 years that still smelled, faintly and inexplicably, like the house she had grown up in. She set these objects on the kitchen counter. She sat down. She waited. Daniel called Patricia's office for the first time on the Tuesday, the following day. He identified himself clearly and asked to confirm the estate's current status. He asked about the property portfolio. He asked about the liquidity timeline. He asked whether the preliminary notification had also gone to the relevant financial institutions because he wanted to understand what steps would need to be taken on that end before the formal process began. His voice, as Patricia's assistant documented it, was calm and businesslike. He did not ask how his mother had died. He did not ask whether there had been any suffering. He asked about the transfer timeline, and he asked it within 48 hours of learning his mother was gone. Margaret listened to the recording of that call from the rented kitchen table that evening, the journal open in front of her and nothing written in it, the photograph of David face up on the counter, and she did not cry. She sat there in the silence and understood with a clarity she had never wanted that she had not been wrong. She had never been wrong. She had simply been hoping. Renee called twice in the first week. The first call was to confirm the formal notification. The second call, the one Margaret would return to for years afterward, was a single question: whether the scholarship fund had been formally established prior to Margaret's passing or whether it was still in a preliminary state. Patricia's assistant confirmed it was preliminary. Renee said, "I see." Then she said, "Thank you." Then the call ended. Margaret had written in her journal years earlier, in an entry from 2004, when Renee was 22 and had called her mother 3 times in a single week for no particular reason, that Renee was the one who understood without being told. She had written it with pride. She read it again in the rented house on the 4th night, and then she closed the journal and put it on the floor and did not pick it up again for several days. Thomas did not call at all. He sent 2 text messages to Patricia's office. The first asked about the property address for the estate's primary asset. The second asked whether a personal representative had been designated for the preliminary process, and if so, who. No salutation, no sign-off. No reference to his mother as a person, As a woman who had raised him, as someone whose absence had created the situation, he was now managing through text messages sent, according to the timestamps Patricia's assistant logged, at 7:40 in the evening on a Wednesday, which meant he had waited 2 full days after the notification before picking up his phone. And when he did, the message he sent contained no grief at all. Margaret read those texts on a Thursday morning, sitting in the rented bedroom in the pale October light, and she cried. Not loudly, not with the shape that grief takes in films. She cried the way people cry when something they feared has finally arrived, and the fear has become real, and the relief of certainty and the devastation of it are the exact same feeling. She resurfaced on day 21. Patricia placed the calls personally, one to each child, within a 4-hour window on a Friday afternoon in late October. She explained that there had been an error in the notification process, a procedural irregularity in the documentation, a premature notice, and that Margaret was in fact alive and well. She gave them Margaret's phone number. She asked them to call. Daniel called Patricia back first. He asked whether the notification error created any legal liability for the estate. He asked whether the documentation that had been generated during the 21 days would need to be formally voided or could simply be set aside. He asked 2 questions about the portfolio before he asked whether his mother was all right. Margaret did not speak to Daniel for 11 days after she came home. Not because she was refusing, she left the door open. He did not call. Renee called Margaret directly within 20 minutes of Patricia's call. She was crying before Margaret answered. She asked if her mother was okay. She asked where she had been. She said she needed to see her. Margaret drove to Renee's apartment the following afternoon. They sat at Renee's kitchen table, and Margaret did not say very much at all. And Renee, who had always understood without being told, understood this time too. She understood that her mother had heard everything. She understood what that meant about what she had said, and what she had failed to say, and what the call about the scholarship fund revealed about the part of herself she had not wanted to examine. She did not make excuses, she sat with it. The kitchen was small and warm and smelled like coffee, and neither of them moved from the table for almost 2 hours. Thomas came to Margaret's house 11 days after she resurfaced, the same day Daniel finally called. He arrived unannounced in the early afternoon, when the light in the kitchen was low and the room had the quiet of a weekday. He knocked twice and stood at the door with his hands in his pockets. Margaret opened it. He did not apologize, not immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He sat down at the kitchen table, where he had eaten every Sunday dinner of his childhood, and he looked at the window where the African violet had been, and he said, "I didn't know how to feel sad. I only knew how to do things." That was the first honest sentence Thomas had said to his mother in years. She recognized it as honest because it cost him something to say it. They sat in that kitchen for 3 hours. What passed between them during those 3 hours Margaret has not shared with anyone. What she has said, the only thing she has said, is that it was the first real conversation she and her youngest child had ever had. The estate was restructured in the months that followed. The scholarship fund was formally established and fully funded, outside the family's access, protected by the legal framework that Patricia had spent 15 years preparing to use. The property portfolio was placed in a professional trust managed through Patricia's office. The children received what was fair. The process was handled without ceremony and without drama. Margaret signed the final documents on a Tuesday in February, sitting at Patricia's desk with a cup of coffee she had barely touched. And when it was done, she looked out the window at the gray winter street and felt something she recognized, after a moment, as relief. Not happiness, not resolution. The quieter, more durable thing. The sense of a door closing behind her and the knowledge that what lay ahead was finally, for the first time in 30 years, an open question. She moved into a smaller house the following spring, 2 bedrooms instead of 5, a garden that got afternoon sun. She kept the kitchen table but let the rest of the furniture go. She bought a new African violet at a nursery 12 minutes from her house and set it on the windowsill in the afternoon light and found, to her own surprise, that it made her happy in a way she had not expected to feel again. On her 65th birthday, she opened the door to find Thomas standing on the step with a plant in his hands. Not just any plant, an African violet, the same variety, the same color. He had found it at a specialty nursery 40 minutes from his apartment. She asked him how he had known. He said he remembered it from when he was small. He said it was always in the window. She took the plant from his hands and held it for a moment, and then she set it on the counter next to the one she had already bought, and the two plants sat side by side in the winter light, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. Margaret Calloway is still alive. She tends her garden in the mornings and reads in the evenings and calls Cecile on Sundays, the way she has since they were 19 years old. She sees her children on terms that are different from anything that came before, more honest, more careful, and stripped of the particular performance that had shaped their relationships for years. She has never told them the full details of what she heard during those 21 days. They know enough. They know what they said and what they failed to say, and they know that she knows, and that knowledge sits in the room with them during every visit and makes everything that happens in that room more real than it would otherwise be. Some of those visits are warm, some are awkward, all of them are true. She said something, in a conversation with Cecile the winter after the estate was settled, that Cecile has since repeated with Margaret's permission. She said, "I spent 30 years afraid of what my children would become, afraid that the things I built would end up mattering more to them than I did. And when I finally looked at it directly, the fear was right, partly, but the fear was also mine to own. I taught them that money was the background of everything. I taught them that by the way I moved through the world. I gave them the values I was afraid they'd develop, because those values were already in the house." She paused. She looked out the window at the garden, where the last of the autumn light was falling across the grass. Then she said, "The thing about being right about a fear is that it doesn't mean you were powerless. It just means you were paying attention. And you can start paying attention differently. That's the only thing any of us can actually do. Start paying attention differently." Margaret Calloway faked her death to learn the truth about her children. The truth arrived exactly as she had feared it would. And what she did with that truth, not the confrontation, not the restructuring, not the legal documents filed in Patricia's office, but the quiet, deliberate, deeply unglamorous work of rebuilding something real from what remained. That is the part of the story that deserves to be seen. Not because it resolved cleanly. It did not resolve cleanly. But because she chose to remain, to stay present, to keep the door open, to place two African violets side by side on a kitchen windowsill on a cold February morning, and let that be enough for now. The courage it takes to keep building after you have already seen the cracks is not the courage stories usually celebrate, but it may be the only courage that actually matters.